Hello, class. This is Mr. Hart, and in this podcast, we want to start the Volcanoes chapter of our textbook. Okay, so let's just start with the basic question: what is a volcano? So you probably have a good intuitive sense of what a volcano is. You've probably seen videos or pictures of a volcanic explosion like this one, but we want to think about a good definition of what a volcano actually is. Okay, there's a couple of different examples of different types of volcanoes. Okay, but a general definition you can think of is just any location where magma can reach the Earth's surface. Okay, any type of vent for magma to flow through. Okay, and so we want to look at where our volcano is located. A big area that contains about 80% of the world's volcanoes is what we call the Ring of Fire. Okay, when we looked at the plate tectonics chapter of our textbook, we talked about how this is the Pacific Plate region, right? And so this area is constantly subducting under other plates. So we get a lot of volcanoes. Okay, some of the major volcanoes that you've heard of are along this area. Okay, Krakatoa, Mount Fuji, Mount St. Helens. Those volcanoes all are along the Ring of Fire. Okay, and it has this name because it's known for all these volcanoes. So again, about 80% of the world's volcanoes are in this area. Okay, so let's look at what can cause volcanoes. This is a little bit of review from the plate tectonics chapter again. Okay, but one reason we can get a volcano is from a convergent plate boundary. If you remember, if we have a subducting plate that goes underneath another, it will start to melt in the asthenosphere, and that heat and magma will start to come up to the surface, which generates a volcano. Okay, so you have the subducting plate that heats up and it sinks into the mantle. Here's another interesting fact. Along these oceanic subducting plates, we have the water that comes in with it, and so that lowers the melting point of the mantle material, which increases the melting. Okay, so this is why some of those volcanoes are so dangerous and so well known, because the water is actually helping the magma increase in its melting and of the material. And so those oceanic plates cause a lot of magma, cause these very famous volcanoes. Okay. Another reason we can have a volcano is from a divergent plate boundary. Okay, if you remember when we looked at Iceland, for example, we saw that it had very volcanic material in very volcanic locations because those two plates are separating and the magma is filling in that space. Okay, and so hot mantle rock rises where the plates are moving apart, filling in the gap basically. This releases pressure on the mantle, which lowers its melting temperature. Okay, so again, we can have volcanoes, and divergent plate boundaries or divergent plate boundary volcanoes are very cool because they're actually lines instead of just the standard cylinder or cinder cones and things like that. We get these huge lines of volcanic activity, which we call fissure. And so these look very cool. We'll talk about these more later in the chapter, but just keep in mind if you have a divergent plate boundary, you can also get volcanic activity. Okay. And then the last one is what we call a hotspot. If you remember, hotspot is just an area in the mantle that has a very thin amount of crust that's blocking it in the lithosphere, and so the magma will slowly melt it away and cause a hotspot. Okay, Yellowstone's an example, which is why we have all the geysers in Yellowstone. Hawaii is an example of a hotspot, but we just get that pressure that is able to break through the lithosphere and create a volcanic opening. Okay, and again, these hotspots can be found anywhere along a plate. It doesn't have to be on the boundary. It doesn't have to be in the center. Just anywhere is where you can get a hotspot. Anywhere the lithosphere is thin. Okay, so those are the three ways we can get volcanoes: from the convergent plate boundaries, the divergent plate boundaries, and the hotspots. Okay, let's look at the different types of volcanoes that you'll actually see from these locations. Okay, the first type is what we call a composite volcano. Okay, so this is Mount Fuji in Japan. Okay, and you notice it has a very steep hill. Okay, it's very narrow. Very steep sides, and this is because of the viscousness of the lava, okay, or how viscous the lava is. Okay, and the word viscous or viscosity, it means that the magma is very sticky. It doesn't like to flow very well. Think of like molasses or honey. Okay, it doesn't flow everywhere. If you pour water on the floor, for example, it will spread out very far. If you pour honey on the floor, it will pretty much stay in the same spot. Okay, so this lava is viscous, meaning it doesn't like to move around. It doesn't flow very well. It's very sticky. Okay, and so it cannot travel far down the sides of the volcano before it solidifies, which creates these steep slopes. So you can imagine if I had lava flowing down this mountainside, it doesn't get very far before it cools. And so then you get this steep slope that keeps getting steeper and steeper and steeper because the magma and the lava doesn't go anywhere. It stays near the volcano before it solidifies. Okay. This high viscosity also causes some eruptions to explode as ash and small rocks. Okay. So not only are composite volcanoes very steep, they're generally known for having large explosions because they build up a lot of pressure before they explode. Okay. And so that's a composite volcano again because of the viscosity of the lava or the amount of flow that it has. It has very little amount of flow. It creates these steep slopes and has explosive eruptions. Okay. Let's look at the internal structure. You don't have to know all these different parts, but the main thing is you have this magma chamber down here at the bottom, and there's a vent for the magma to come through. And this vent will have the eruptions, have the explosions. And again, this lava will go a small distance before it solidifies. And so we get these nice, steep layers of rock that build up from the eruptions. Okay. Sometimes you can even get a secondary volcano building on top of another because it, again, doesn't flow very far. And so you can actually get some double volcanoes, which is kind of interesting. Okay. So that's a composite volcano. In comparison, we also have shield volcanoes. Okay. Shield volcanoes get their name from their shape. Although shield volcanoes are not steep, they may be very large. Okay, so if you think of a shield volcano, it's nice and flat. You can kind of imagine if you laid a medieval shield on the ground flat, okay, it'd have this nice flat shape to it, kind of that bulge. But if you notice, this is the cloud line right here, okay, in this picture. So this volcano is very, very tall. But again, it's very, very wide as well, okay. The reason being that the shield volcanoes do not have high viscosity lava. They have lava that flows very easily. So instead of staying near the volcano, it spreads out very, very far before it solidifies. And so we get these nice, long, and wide volcanoes. Okay. Shield volcanoes are also known for not being very explosive. The lava flows out very naturally. If you've ever seen Kilauea volcano in Hawaii, that's an example of a shield volcano. It has very effusive lava that just moves very slowly, very easily down the sides, and it just creates these very wide volcanoes. Okay. And so again, similar structure, the magma chamber, the vent, but again, it has a nice gentle slope because the lava is able to flow a far distance before it solidifies. Okay. The next one is probably what you think of when you think of a volcano, and that's a cinder cone volcano. And these are the most common types. They're kind of like mini versions of composite volcanoes, okay? They are smaller. They rarely reach higher than 300 meters in height, and they have the steep sides, okay? They're kind of like a composite volcano that only has erupted once or grows very rapidly, usually from a single eruption. Okay, so the eruption will occur, it will cause this break, it has this material that comes out and solidifies on the side, but generally speaking, it releases enough pressure that the volcano doesn't erupt again. Okay, and so you get this nice steep hill, just like a composite volcano, but it just doesn't have a lot of magma to generate more eruptions. Okay, so they usually erupt only once or have one series of eruptions. Okay, but they're very, very small and they're very, very common. So they just kind of release that energy and then they kind of die off. Okay, so when you draw a volcano, if you've ever drawn one, when you were a kid, you probably drew it like this with the volcano and the magma coming out and exploding. Okay, that's a cinder cone volcano. That's what you're drawing generally when you're drawing a volcano. And the way you can kind of tell the cinder cone is because of its shape, and they generally have this bowl shape in the bottom or at the top of the volcano, which we call the caldera. Okay, and we'll talk about that more later, but that's kind of a distinctive feature of the cinder cone volcanoes is this bowl at the top. Okay, but again, they're kind of miniature version of composite volcanoes, and they kind of just have a single series of eruptions and then they're finished. Okay. All right, and again, the structure is very similar to a composite volcano with the magma chamber, the vent, and then the steep sides from the piling up of the material. Okay. The last volcano type we want to talk about is a supervolcano, which covers a very large area. If you look at this, you can tell this is actually in Arizona. Okay, here's Flagstaff, Arizona. Okay, and you can see this covers a very large area on the map. Okay, probably a good 50 to 100 miles. And so people are always wondering, oh, supervolcano, it sounds very dangerous. They're afraid that the whole area is just going to blow up at once. Well, That's not going to happen. That means there's a very large magma chamber underneath here. But the problem is it can't all come up at once. Generally speaking, it has to come through a single vent. So the danger of a supervolcano isn't so much that this whole area is going to blow at once. It's that there's going to be a vent that occurs, and then you're going to have a nice large amount of magma that can come up out of it. So if a single volcano is able to be generated, then you can have a very large eruption from that single volcano. Okay. But these are more rare, obviously. They're very, very large. But again, the danger is not so much of the whole thing going off at once, but from the huge amount of magma that you do have available if there is an eruption. Okay? All right, and the last thing we want to talk about for this podcast is the difference between the different types of eruptions. So there's two eruptions we want to know. There's explosive eruptions, which you probably think of when you think of volcano, this huge eruption of ash and dust and material that comes out with the lava. And then there's effusive eruptions, which flows out nice and easily. Okay, doesn't explode or anything. It just flows along the sides of the mountain or the sides of the volcano. Okay, so with explosive eruptions, okay, you can have these huge clouds, which we call pyroclastic flows. They will just come down, and it has the magma, it has the rock and the material. Okay, and this huge cloud will actually go in and destroy, forests and buildings and everything as it plows through. It's almost like a sandstorm, okay, but even worse because there's so much material that's going through it. If you look at this picture from the Mount St. Helens eruption, all this, rock and material came through with this pyroclastic flow. Okay, so this cloud isn't just nice and light. It's not like being hit with a nice breeze. Okay, this would hurt if you got hit by this cloud. Okay, lots of material that's going through. The magma's in there as well. The lava flowing with it. Okay. And so with explosive eruptions, the most dangerous part of the eruption is actually the material that's hitting into objects during the eruption. Okay. On the opposite end of the scale, you have the effusive eruptions, where there's not so much material going through, but the danger is from the actual lava itself. Okay. The lava is still very hot. It can go a far distance because it has the nice flow, right? It's not very viscous. And so the lava goes a very far distance before it cools, and so it can actually melt roads and forests and things before it ever cools down. Okay. So with explosive eruptions, the dangers with the actual material destroying objects. With effusive eruptions, okay, it's from the actual heat from the lava. Okay. All right, so that's all we want to cover for this podcast. So we looked at the different ways we can get volcanoes. We looked at the different types of volcanoes that we can generate, and then we looked at the different types of eruptions that we can get. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Let me know if you have any questions, and thank you for watching.